Vadim Zaitsev had always been attentive to small things, but once trusting a close person, he almost lost everything. The wind howled outside the office window, filling the day with disturbing sounds. Vadim sat at a massive oak desk, a pile of documents in front of him, and his lawyer, Maxim Isayev, across from him. The atmosphere in the room was tense, as if the air had grown thick and heavy. "Look, Maxim, is there really nothing that can be done now?" Vadim's voice was low, almost a whisper, but a desperate hope could be heard in it. The lawyer sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. "Vadim Borisovich, I'd like to say there is a way out, but we've exhausted all legal options. Too much debt, too little time." Vadim leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What if we try restructuring? Find investors? Maybe there's someone willing to invest? I can't just sit idly by." Maxim shook his head. "We've explored that option as well. The company doesn't have enough assets to attract serious investors. The creditors are waiting for their money and—" He was silent for a while, choosing his words. "They already want theirs." "Shit, shit!" Vadim's voice exploded into a scream, and he slammed his fist down on the table with force. "Is this it? Is this the end?" The office door ajar and the secretary, Victoria, cautiously peeked inside. She knew her boss was going through a rough patch, but she hadn't expected such a reaction. "Vadim Borisovich, are you all right?" Her voice trembled with excitement. Vadim turned around, his eyes glittering with anger and despair. "No, Victoria, nothing is all right with us," he replied gruffly. Then, as if realizing his abruptness, waved his hand. "Close the door." Victoria nodded and quietly closed the door behind her. Maxim watched the scene, his face remaining impenetrable. "Vadim Borisovich, may I be excused?" the lawyer asked, putting the papers into his briefcase. Vadim looked at him for a long moment, then slowly rose and held out his hand. "Thank you, Maxim, for everything. Even though you say there's no way out, I can't just give up." Maxim nodded, shaking Vadim's hand. "I understand, Vadim. If you find some way, I'm always ready to help, but—" He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else, but changed his mind. "Take care." When the door closed behind the lawyer, Vadim sat back in his chair. He squeezed his temples with his hands, trying to put his thoughts in order. All the options he was going over in his head seemed useless. He could feel his world crumbling under the weight of the circumstances. "Where did I miscalculate so badly?" he muttered, closing his eyes. After a few minutes, gathering his strength, Vadim threw on his coat, picked up his bag, and headed for the exit. Victoria was sitting at her desk. Her face was focused, but when she saw her boss, she immediately stood up. "Vadim Borisovich, will you be back today?" she asked cautiously. "No, I'm not here for anyone." He cut off and went out. Vadim got into the car, started the engine, and drove sharply into the road. The wind outside was bending the trees, and there was a sepulchral silence in the cabin, broken only by the noise of the engine. He drove without purpose, not noticing anything around him. At a traffic light turned red, Vadim stopped and involuntarily looked toward the curb. There stood a boy of about 12 with a dirty bucket and an old rag in his hands. He was quickly approaching the cars, wiping the windows and saying something to the drivers. His jacket barely protected him from the cold, and his face looked haggard, but there was a cheeky sparkle in his eyes. The boy approached Vadim's car and gestured for him to open the window. The man reluctantly rolled down the window. "Uncle, would you like me to clean the window?" Vadim silently pulled out the last of his pocket money and held it out to the boy. "Thanks, but I won't have that much change," he replied shortly. "They won't do me any good anymore." The boy gazed into Vadim's face and seemed to recognize him. "Hey, uncle, I know how to save your firm," he said suddenly, leaning closer to the window. Vadim turned sharply toward him. The boy's words sounded so absurd that he didn't immediately believe his ears. "What did you say?" he interjected, frowning. "I know how to help you," the boy repeated calmly, as if it was about something very mundane. "How do you even know about my company?" asked Vadim, feeling his irritation gradually replaced by curiosity. "But it's your firm that's just around the corner over there." The boy waved his hand in the direction of the city center. "You're Vadim Zaitsev, right?" Vadim nodded silently. He couldn't believe that this street kid had figured him out so easily. "Wait here," he said, turning on his turn signal. "I'll park." A minute later, Vadim stopped the car at the sidewalk and waved to the boy. inviting him to get in. "Come on, tell me what you mean," he said as the boy settled into the passenger seat, remembering to place his bucket on the floor. The boy crumpled a little, obviously gathering his thoughts. "You need to double-check the paperwork on your latest project," he finally said. Vadim frowned. "And how do you know that?" "Don't you recognize me?" the boy asked, staring intently into his eyes. "No," Vadim replied, shrugging his shoulders. "Who are you?" "My name is Danil," the boy pronounced. "My mom used to work for you as an accountant. Her name is Karina Belik." Vadim froze, stunned. That name triggered many memories in his mind. Karina had been one of the best employees of his company, but a few years ago she had been fired after some scandal involving financial reports. He still didn't know all the details of that case. "Karina is your mom?" he asked again. Danil nodded. "She always said you were set up," the boy continued, "but no one wanted to listen to her. She tried to figure it out, but they wouldn't let her." Vadim hesitated for a moment. His thoughts wavered between skepticism and the desperation of wanting to grasp at any straw. "Do you think she can help me?" he asked at last. "I think so," Danil replied. "Give her a call. I'm sure she'll know what to do." Vadim looked at the boy with sudden respect. There was a confidence in his words that made one believe. "All right," he pronounced, "and thank you, boy. You've given me a chance. If it works, I owe you one." Danil only smiled and then, grabbing his bucket, jumped out of the car. "Good luck, uncle," he shouted before disappearing into the crowd. Vadim stared after him, realizing that this strange and unexpected conversation could be the start of something new. His thoughts returned again and again to the woman he had so summarily dismissed. The scandal, the accusations, the need to keep the issue quiet. He remembered Karina Belik walking out of her office one day, clutching a box of personal belongings in her hands and with her head held proudly high, even though her face read despair. "Damn it," Vadim muttered and grabbed his phone. He stared at the phone, wondering if Karina would agree to talk to him. "Victoria," he said, dialing his secretary's number. "Get me Karina Belik's phone number." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Victoria answered in a cautious voice. "Vadim Borisovich, are you sure? Isn't she?" "Yes, I'm sure. Just find the number." His voice sounded firm, though inside everything clenched with doubt. A couple minutes later, Vadim's phone vibrated. A message had arrived. Vadim stared at the numbers for a long time until he felt his palms sweating. Dozens of scenarios sounded in his head, and none of them seemed successful. Finally, he took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The beeps seemed endless. His heart pounded like a schoolboy preparing to confess to a misdemeanor. "I'm listening." The voice on the other end was cold but still recognizable. Vadim froze before forcing himself to speak. This is Vadim Borisovich. Karina, do you have a couple minutes to talk?" There was silence for a second. Then came a reply full of sarcasm. "Vadim Borisovich, are you calling to accuse me of something again?" Vadim squeezed his fingers so hard that they turned white. "No, Karina. I would like to discuss with you some matters concerning my company. Perhaps we could have a cup of coffee." His voice trembled, though he tried hard to remain confident. She was silent for a few seconds, and Vadim was almost certain she would disagree. "Coffee, you say?" Karina grinned. "Tomorrow at noon. There's a cafe near the garment factory. Do you know where it is?" "I know, thank you." He was relieved, though he realized this was only the beginning. "Don't be late, Vadim Borisovich. I don't have much time," she added before disconnecting. Vadim put the phone down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the steering wheel. He covered his face with his hands, contemplating what had just happened. He had managed to arrange a meeting, but what would that conversation be like? He imagined Karina's cold stare, her impeccable professionalism, and her contempt. "Well," he exhaled, looking in the mirror, "this is my only chance." He started the car and drove home. In the evening, he sat in his empty house. He had a glass of whiskey in his hands and memories in his head. He was trying to figure out where he had made a mistake, why a once successful businessman was in this position. He thought he could hear his father's voice. "Never burn bridges, Vadim. Never." The next morning, Vadim woke up from a restless sleep. He dreamed of Karina, but not at the time of his dismissal, but the one who was always the first to work and the last to go home. The one who was considered one of the best employees, and the one he had so quickly written off. Vadim quickly cleaned himself up and went to work. Victoria met him at the elevator. Vadim Borisovich, I've prepared the company documents for you. Is there anything else you need? Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed anxiety. No, thank you, Victoria, he replied. And I'm sorry about yesterday. I wasn't myself. I understand, she nodded briefly. Good luck today. Thanks, I'll need it, he sighed, heading for the office. A new day awaited him, and with it a chance to make things right. Vadim had been feeling uncomfortable since the morning. The excitement was growing by the minute. He put the documents aside, glancing at his watch. 11:30. There was half an hour left before his meeting with Karina. He checked his appearance. Perfectly ironed jacket, light-colored shirt, polished shoes. Everything said that he was ready for this meeting, but inside everything was clenching. Victoria, if anyone comes looking for me, tell them I went home. He turned to the secretary as he walked past. Of course, Vadim Borisovich, she replied with a slight smile, encouraging him with a look. An hour later, he was already sitting at a table in a small cafe by the window. The place was modest but cozy, with warm wooden panels and the smell of freshly ground coffee. Vadim chose a spot where he could see the front door so he wouldn't miss the moment Karina appeared. He drummed his fingers nervously on the surface of the table. The door opened, and his gaze immediately settled on the woman who entered. Karina looked different than he remembered her. She was dressed in a strict but elegant coat, and her hair was arranged in a neat bun. She looked around, spotted him, and approached the table. Vadim hastily stood up. Hello, Karina. He held out his hand and, after hesitating, helped her take off her coat. Hello, Vadim Borisovich. I honestly confess I didn't expect to hear from you. Her voice was calm, but her gaze betrayed an underlying wariness. They sat down at the table. The waiter approaching them took the order. Vadim asked for coffee and Karina asked for tea with honey. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he began, trying to find the words. I've been thinking for a long time about whether to come. She folded her hands on the table. What do you need from me, Vadim Borisovich? Vadim hesitated, but then decided to go straight ahead. Karina, you have a wonderful son, smart, savvy. Karina raised her eyebrows. My God, where did you meet him? She asked in surprise. At a stoplight. Was he washing cars again? Her voice became stern and her face frowned. Vadim smiled involuntarily. Yes, but he's doing it to help you. He seems very caring. Karina closed her eyes, clearly holding back her emotions. Oh, he's going to get it from me today, she muttered, and then looked at Vadim. But that's not the point. What do you want from me? Vadim leaned forward, folding his arms. I want to right the wrongs of the past. I know you were treated unfairly, and I want to apologize. And I hope you can help me. She laughed a short, bitter laugh. Apologize? After all these years? Vadim Borisovich, you kicked me out without even giving me a chance to explain myself, and now you suddenly need my help? Vadim looked at her with regret. Yes, you're right, I did a terrible thing. But at the time, I trusted the words of my assistant. I didn't want to look into it, didn't see any reason to doubt. Karina interrupted him. Your assistant, Vadim Borisovich, she began, and her voice trembled with restrained anger. Accused me of something I didn't do, and I know he did it to cover up his own machinations. Vadim leaned back in his chair, stunned by her words. Shenanigans? What do you mean? She folded her arms across her chest and looked at him directly. Your dear Anton has been transferring large sums of money through dummy accounts. I noticed it when I checked the paperwork. Tried to tell you, but do you remember how it ended? Vadim frowned, trying to comprehend what he had heard. Are you saying he was, stealing money from the company, and I didn't notice it? Exactly. I tried to prevent it, but I was made out to be a thief. I lost everything, my job, my reputation. And now my son has to wash car windows to help us survive. Her voice shook, but she immediately pulled herself together. Vadim was silent for a long time, pondering her words. Finally, he spoke. Karina, I beg you, please help me. I know I don't deserve it, but if there's a chance, you're the only one who can give it to me. She looked at him intently, as if trying to decide if he could be trusted. I will help, but only for me and my son. You will bring me all the necessary documents and we will start work. Vadim barely held back a sigh of relief. Thank you. Thank you, Karina. I promise that I will correct all my mistakes. She nodded, got up from the table and put on her coat. Vadim rose with her. I'll see you tonight. Bring whatever you have, she said as she left. Vadim remained standing by the table, watching her leave the cafe. There was hope in his heart for the first time in a long time, but now he had to fulfill his promise and do everything to regain not only the company, but also her trust. Vadim sat down again and began to ponder whether it was worth bothering Albert Vlasov, his old friend who had long worked as a private detective. Recent events had finally knocked him out of his rut, and he realized that he could not cope on his own. Finally, he made up his mind, dialed a number, and put the phone to his ear. Albert, hi. This is Vadim Zaitsev. The voice sounded strained. Vadim, I didn't expect to hear from you, my friend. How are you? Replied the chipper voice on the other end. Honestly, I'm in total chaos. Albert, I need your help. Vadim tried to keep his voice steady, but a slight tremor gave out. Well, let's meet and discuss what happened. I'm in the office right now. Come over as soon as you can. Thanks, Albert. I'll be there in half an hour. Vadim quickly grabbed his coat, left the cafe, and got into the car. The drive to Albert's office seemed long, even though it usually took only 15 minutes. When he entered the modest building where the detective's office was located, the smell of coffee and paper immediately hit his nose. On the door hung a sign, Albert Vlasov, private detective. Vadim knocked and opened the door ajar. Come in, Vadim, called out Albert loudly, sitting behind a desk piled with folders and documents. His smile was wide, as it always was. Good to see you, old boy. Hi, Albert. Thanks for agreeing to meet on such short notice, Vadim said, shaking his friend's hand and sitting down across from him. Albert looked a little older. The gray strands now stood out more prominently on his temples, but his eyes still sparkled with energy. So tell me, what's your trouble? The detective asked, pushing his cup of coffee aside. Albert, I think my assistant Anton set me up. Vadim paused to calm himself. He's been stealing money from the company, probably for several years now, and I suspect he's been passing information to my competitors. Albert frowned, listening. Is that serious? Are you sure about this? Or just a hunch so far? I'm not completely sure, but I have reason to think so. A former employee, Karina, told me that he was fraudulently withdrawing large sums of money. She tried to warn me, but I didn't believe her at the time. Now the company is on the verge of bankruptcy. Vadim lowered his head. Albert leaned back in his chair and thought, you know, buddy, if Anton is really involved in this, we can nail him. But first we need proof. Have you found anything? Not yet. Karina offered to help check the paperwork. I'll get the paperwork to her tonight. Good, you're doing the right thing. Now tell me, who else could have been involved? Did Anton act alone? I don't know. There may have been someone helping him. I don't know who it could have been, but I'm sure he couldn't have pulled it off alone. Vadim looked at his friend hopefully. Albert, can you help me? Sure, the detective replied firmly. First, we need to find out how long he's been doing this and where the money went. I can run his accounts and connections, but that will take time. Are you up for that? I have no other choice, Vadim replied, clenching his hands into fists. If I do nothing, the company will collapse completely. Albert smiled. You know, I've always respected your determination. Let's start small. Send me copies of the documents you and Karina will check. Also, be careful, Vadim. If Anton senses you know something, he may try to cover his tracks. Vadim nodded. I understand. Thank you, Albert. You've been a big help to me right now. Hey, we're friends. You'd do the same thing if you were me. They shook hands and Vadim felt the tension let go a little. Walking out of the office, he felt for the first time in a long time that there was someone who was really on his side. As he got into the car, thoughts began to swarm in his head again. If Albert is right and we find proof, this could be my chance to get the company back. The main thing is to act quickly. Vadim paced nervously around his office, checking the folders and papers he had to take with him. Karina had given clear instructions on what documents would be required for analysis. His hands trembled faintly as he sorted through the numerous reports, invoices, and contracts. The company was in danger of disaster, and every missed moment brought its end closer. After collecting the necessary files, he grabbed his briefcase and headed for the exit. Already at the door, a familiar voice called out to him. Vadim! Anton's cheerful but wary voice sounded. Buddy, where are you in such a hurry? Vadim turned around and looked at his assistant. He was standing in the corridor, dressed in an expensive suit with perfectly styled hair, looking impeccable as always. However, now in his eyes, Vadim saw not the former confidence, but something anxious, as if he was waiting for a catch. I don't have time to talk, Vadim replied sharply, trying not to meet Anton's gaze. Wait, Anton took a step closer. Is something wrong? You look tense. Vadim felt irritation boiling up inside him. He remembered well Karina's words about Anton being involved in embezzlement. But now when he was standing in front of him, it seemed impossible to believe in his betrayal. Tense? Vadim interjected, not hiding his sarcasm. Maybe because my company is crumbling and I'm trying to save it alone? Anton frowned, his smile disappearing. Hey, you know you can count on me? He uttered with apparent sincerity. If you need anything, just say the word. Vadim clenched his teeth, trying to contain his anger. Contradictory feelings were struggling inside him. On the one hand, he wanted to accuse Anton right now and demand an explanation, but on the other he realized that he didn't have hard evidence yet. I appreciate the offer, but I don't need anything yet, he retorted. I have my own business to attend to. I'm running late. Anton raised his eyebrows, his eyes narrowing slightly. What kind of business? A meeting with someone? Or is it a secret? Anton, stay out of this. Get busy doing something useful, Vadim said, and took a step toward the exit. Wait. Anton put a hand on his shoulder. What are you up to? Vadim pulled away abruptly. Look, I really don't have time, he said, his voice turning cold. If you have something to say it directly. Anton faltered, his gaze darting across his friend's face, trying to guess what he was trying to hide. But instead of answering, he only shrugged. Forget it, he muttered. I was just trying to help. You'll help when I ask you to, Vadim said, and without waiting for an answer, headed for the elevator. He dialed Karina's number to warn her that he was on his way out. Now he had no doubts left. The truth would come out sooner or later, and the guilty would be punished. After a while, the bell rang, and Karina opened the door. Come in, Vadim Borisovich. She stepped aside, and he entered the apartment. I've collected all the documents you asked for. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. Come into the kitchen. The room was cozy and warm. The kitchen had a light aroma of freshly brewed tea and apple pie that Karina had just put on the table. She sat down across from him, diligently studying the papers he had brought her. She held out several sheets to him, pointing out lines with inaccuracies. Did he really do all this? Wondered Vadim. And what are these numbers? Asked Karina, pointing to a line in one of the documents. That's supposed to be different altogether. I don't know who wrote it, but it's clearly a setup. Vadim Borisovich. I can't explain it. Vadim was confused. I certainly wouldn't sign this. Karina picked up another sheet, scrutinizing it carefully. She couldn't believe that someone had so blatantly tried to frame Vadim. She was used to honesty, and this one clearly smelled of something foul. Wait. She leaned closer to the documents, as if searching for something. There's another key spot here. It all fits. You're right, Vadim. Someone is clearly trying to do something to deprive you of your company. And not just any company. You could go to jail for that kind of information. You think it's all Anton? Vadim looked at her with desperation, as if this was his last chance. Or did he have someone helping him? Karina lifted her head and looked at him carefully. I can't know that for sure. But in that you're being set up by your best friend, that's been clear for a long time. Whether he's acting in concert with someone else or alone, I don't know, she said firmly. Danila, Karina's son, entered the kitchen at that moment, and a smile appeared on his face. Vadim Borisovich. Did you call Mom after all? He said with a slight mocking tone. Vadim looked at the boy with a smile. Thanks for the advice, Donald, he said, trying not to show that he was slightly taken aback by the unexpected help from the teenager. Karina smiled, but there was wariness in her eyes. She knew that the request for help was her son's doing. So that's how you knew all this? She muttered, looking at Danil. I didn't realize you were so good at keeping track of what was going on. Danil answered her with a wide smile. Well, yes, you're always telling me to mind my own business. But here, Mom, you're wrong. Vadim smiled involuntarily. Danel was unusually mature for his age. "Karina, your son is a miracle," he said, standing up and shaking the boy's shoulder. Danel only hummed, but you could see in his eyes that he was proud of himself. "Yes, indeed," Karina nodded approvingly. "But don't forget that you don't know everything. There are some things that are not for your ears." Danelle frowned, clearly not understanding what she was talking about. "Too bad they want to hide things from me again," he said with slight displeasure. "No, it's just that you've done enough already," Karina replied, trying to calm him down. Meanwhile, Vadim was looking carefully at the papers and seemed to realize something. "Karina, this really isn't just a mistake after all. It's a purposeful setup," he said, turning to her. "Someone really wants to deprive me of everything." Karina pressed her lips together, scrutinizing his expression. "Yes, that's right," she said firmly. Vadim shook his head. "I don't understand. Is Anton really that greedy for money?" "That's one assumption," Karina shrugged. "We have to dig deeper to find traces of whoever is doing this." Vadim nodded, realizing he had a chance this time, but he had to be careful. "But how do I make sure I don't fall for another trap?" he asked. Karina was silent for a moment, pondering. "We need to find the information this man is trying to hide. He may have connections in your company, or he may have been doing this outside the office." Vadim sighed and his eyes darkened. "I'll have a detective help me figure that out." Karina nodded. There was no time for doubt in this situation. They had to act quickly. "We'll definitely find the evidence," she said, taking his hand. Vadim turned to her, a new realization gleaming in his eyes. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would be as willing to help me as you are." Karina smiled, but there was a chill in her smile. She knew that she and Vadim were in the center of a game in which the stakes were high. "If I save the company, will you return to your position?" he asked suddenly, rising from his seat. He looked at Karina. There was genuine hope in his eyes. She shrugged, trying to hide her excitement. "It's something to think about, but it's not a priority. First, we need to deal with who's behind all this. The rest comes later." Vadim nodded and walked toward the door. "Okay, thank you for everything." She silently escorted him out with a look and then closed the door. After Vadim left, Karina stood by the window, wondering how far they could go in this game. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't stop until she found all the evidence and figured out who was behind these intrigues. When once again Donald entered the kitchen, his eyes glittered with curiosity. "So now what? Are we going to look for whoever is behind this after all?" Karina looked at him and laughed. "Yes, Daniil, you are quite the detective. We will look, and we will find all the clues so that this crime will not go unpunished." In the morning, Vadim couldn't shake off the feeling of anxiety that was gripping him more and more every minute. He knew that his life depended on what he did now. As he sat in his office listening to the ringing of the phone, his thoughts were restlessly darting around. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Time was running out. Clenching his fists, Vadim dialed the number of Maxim, his lawyer, the man he trusted. This was his last chance. "Maxim, I need to see you," Vadim said, trying to keep his voice calm. "There is something important." "Of course, Vadim. When is convenient for you?" replied Maxim with a businesslike tone. "Today by lunchtime, in your office." "It's a deal. I'll see you at 2. Hanging up the phone, Vadim leaned on his desk and looked out the window. He realized that there was less and less time left. By lunchtime, Vadim was already sitting in Maxim's office, in the same building where he had once met with his partners and discussed important deals. Now, however, the atmosphere was quite different. "Hi, Vadim. Good to see you," Maxim said as he entered the office. Tall, with graying temples and neatly trimmed hair, Maxim always looked collected and confident. His eyes were focused. He had already picked up a few documents that Vadim had brought with him. "I see you didn't come empty-handed?" "Yes, I found something." Vadim sat down across from Maxim and handed him a folder of documents. "These are the results of Karina's work. She managed to find inconsistencies that I hadn't noticed myself. I didn't even think that someone could set things up so thoroughly." Maxim opened the documents, checking them carefully. His face remained serious. He showed no emotion, but Vadim saw his eyes narrow as he came across obvious errors and false data. "I must admit, you were very lucky to have someone who found those errors," Maxim finally said, setting the papers aside. "I wouldn't have guessed it myself, Now we have a chance. Vadim felt relieved but anxious at the same time. His voice trembled as he spoke. Maxim, I don't know how I should proceed. Everything is so confusing. I'm afraid these mistakes are only the beginning. I need to get things back on track. But someone is behind this. Someone is running this game. Maxim put his hands on the table, looking at him thoughtfully. Vadim, I understand what you're going through. But right now it's important to focus on what we can do. We have evidence that someone was trying to frame you. That's a start. We have to file a lawsuit and gather all the evidence. All of this was signed by Anton. But for what purpose? And is he the one running the game? Or is he being set up? That's another question. Vadim seemed to exhale. He was ready for any action just to deal with this mayhem. Once this is over, I want my reputation back, he said, as if making a promise to himself. You deserve it, Vadim. Maxim nodded, turning his attention back to the papers. We need to file a lawsuit against Anton and proceed in stages. I'm ready for that step. Maxim smiled, looking at him like an old friend. We have the evidence, Vadim. We can find more evidence if we look for it, but we need to be ready for anything. Vadim nodded slightly. He realized that the fight would be hard, but right now he had a chance. When do we start? He asked, resolutely setting himself up for the fight. Maxim opened his laptop and quickly typed a few commands on the keyboard. Right now, we'll need to talk to the people at your company, he said without looking away from the screen. We need to make sure all trails lead back to Anton, and if he gets nervous, we'll notice it. Vadim closed his eyes, remembering Anton, his best friend. His ambition had always been obvious, and he had never hidden the fact that he dreamed of taking Vadim's place. He was a cruel and calculating man, willing to do anything for power. Anton is too confident in his impunity, Vadim pronounced, clenching his fists. He thinks he can control everything. Maxim looked at him with a serious expression. You've said yourself more than once that he's overconfident. That could play into our hands. People who think no one can catch them often make mistakes. Vadim thought for a moment. A plan was already forming in his head. He knew they had to be ready for battle, but now the main thing was not to make a mistake. Let's start with the people closest to him, he said. I'll talk to colleagues who might know something important. Good, Maxim said, leaning back in his chair. Vadim stood up and began to pace around the office, feeling the tension hanging in the air. It was like a dark tunnel, but now it had a bright end, a chance for salvation. Let's get started, he said with a swell of determination. Let's take action. Maxim looked at him respectfully. In that case, go ahead. Vadim sat in his car, squeezing the gas and trying to shake off the unbearable tension that haunted him. He hadn't been able to sleep properly for days now, and this situation with his company was pulling him down into the abyss. Today he finally had hope, and he couldn't delay. As he pulled up to the house, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Vadim glanced at the screen. It was a call from Albert Vlasov, the detective who was helping him with the investigation. Vadim's heart beat faster. He knew that talking to Albert could prove to be a turning point. Yes, Albert. Did you manage to find out anything? Vadim answered the call, trying to hide the excitement in his voice. Buddy, that young lady was right, Albert said, his voice sounding confident, but with a certain wariness in it. Anton did meet with your main competitor just now and received an envelope from him. I assume there was money in the envelope. Vadim tensed, his heart clenched with rage and excitement. He knew that everything that was happening could not have been an accident. Anton wasn't just a friend. This was a man who worked beside him day in and day out. And now it turned out he was involved in dark deeds. Thanks, buddy, Vadim said, trying not to betray his irritation. He hit the brakes sharply, swerving abruptly to the side. Anton's house was not that far away, and now, knowing that he was meeting with a competitor, Vadim realized that he had to act quickly. He picked up speed, and soon the road led him to Anton's house. Vadim parked the car at the gate, looked around, and, making sure that no one was watching, headed for the door. He knocked with such intention that Anton would have no chance to evade the conversation. A few seconds later, the door swung open. Oh, buddy, why didn't you give me a heads up about your visit? Anton smiled wryly as he stood in the doorway. On his face played overconfidence, but in his eyes read a slight nervousness. Vadim didn't mince words. We need to talk, he said, making no secret of his determination. Anton apparently did not expect such pressure. He looked at Vadim in silence for a minute, then stepped aside, letting him pass. "Come in," Anton said, still trying to remain calm, though his face was already betraying his fear of being exposed. They made their way into the house. Vadim looked around. Everything was as it always was. Soft light, cozy interior, a couple of bottles on the shelves. But now it all seemed fake, like theater sets. He couldn't believe Anton had turned out to be such a man. "Whiskey?" suggested Anton, approaching the bar. "Yes, come on," Vadim replied, sitting down on the couch. He was ready to listen to everything Anton would say. But inside it was already clear. His friend had turned out to be a traitor. Anton poured 2 glasses and handed one to Vadim, sitting down next to him with a smile. His movements were smooth, as if he was trying not to show his nervousness. "And how long have you been spinning your deeds behind my back?" Vadim began, breaking the silence. His voice sounded calmer than he felt. Anton, glass in hand, raised his eyebrows and seemed surprised, but there was still a flicker of alarm in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" he said with obvious bewilderment, but it was obvious that he was trying to keep the situation under control. "Don't play dumb, I've known you too long. Just like I know about your money withdrawal scam and the fact that you set Karina up. And why were you meeting with Evgeny Alexeyevich?" Anton stopped talking abruptly. He stood up quickly and walked to the window. "I don't understand you," Anton said, becoming more tense than ever. Vadim got up from the couch and walked over to him, not giving him a chance to think. "Ah, you don't know he's our main competitor," Vadim said, smirking. He couldn't contain his sarcasm. "And how much did you sell out for?" Anton straightened up, but his face went pale. "You're talking nonsense," Anton shouted, turning on him with anger. "Get out of here. You're going to apologize some more." Vadim set his glass on the coffee table and stepped closer. He could feel the rage bubbling up in his chest, but he still held himself in check. "I won't leave it like this," Vadim hissed, grabbing Anton by the tie, pulling him to him with force. Anton closed his eyes, his face contorted with anger and fear. "What an idiot you are," he said quietly, but his words sounded almost like a threat. Vadim didn't let go of him, continuing to stare straight into his eyes. "I'm going to ruin your life, Anton, and I'm not going to stop. You betrayed me. You ruined my company." After a long pause, Anton broke free of his grip and pushed him away. There was panic in his eyes, but Vadim already knew he wasn't going to stop. Vadim walked out of Anton's house and got into his car, still shaking with adrenaline. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He was ready to destroy Anton, but he knew he couldn't stop there. This was only the first step. He took a deep breath as he looked at the empty road and realized that this game was going to be a long time coming. Anton would fight, of course, but Vadim had proof. "Yeah, how could I not see that?" Vadim said quietly, starting the car. There was no fear or doubt in his voice, only determination. Vadim looked over the next report, trying to make sense of the connections between events that seemed to be getting more and more confusing. Each new discovery raised even more questions, and he could find no peace. With each step of the investigation, it became clearer and clearer. This was a game involving not only his competitors, but also people he had once trusted. This time he was close to an answer, but one more important detail was required. His musings were interrupted by Maxim's call. "Vadim, there's news. We found something you need to see. I think it's key." Maxim's voice sounded strained, as it always did when it came to important information. "What did you find?" Vadim asked, not hiding the anxiety in his voice. He felt that this conversation could be a turning point. "You won't believe it, but your ex-wife is involved in this story," Maxim said, pausing. Vadim felt as if he had missed a blow to the head. He froze, trying to comprehend Maxim's words. It was a low blow, especially considering the relationship they'd had over the past few years. "How is she involved in this?" he asked, hardly knowing what to expect. "She's now the wife of your chief rival," Maxim continued, "and it seems she was the person who encouraged Anton to complicity in this dirty game." Vadim gritted his teeth. He couldn't believe she was involved in his life again, and in such a context. All these years he'd tried to forget her, to get over the divorce, but now she was back at the center of it all. "Is that for sure?" he asked, trying not to give away his shock. We found pictures, tapes of conversations. She met with him several times before all this started. We don't know all the details yet, but it seems she was aware of it and even facilitated Anton's entry into this game. Maxim spoke calmly, but Vadim could hear his voice betraying an awareness of the importance of the situation. Vadim exhaled and closed his eyes. She had been a part of his past, and now she was back to destroy everything he had built. I want to talk to her, Vadim said after a few seconds. Right now. Where is she? She's in the capital right now, but we managed to find out where she'll be tomorrow. If you want, we can arrange a meeting. Do that. I want to know what it's like to be a person willing to go over other people's heads. Vadim cast a glance at the window. This wasn't just a necessity, this was personal. The next morning, Vadim woke up earlier than usual. He couldn't sit quietly at home knowing that he had an important meeting to attend. He felt his pulse quicken at the thought of facing her again. He headed to the office where Maxim was already waiting for him, having prepared all the information about the meeting. They were to meet Vadim's ex-wife at the luxury hotel where she was staying for her visit to the city. At the hotel, the wait was tense, and both men were silent as they thought about what was in store for them. It's all set. She's here, Maxim said without taking his eyes off the window. Vadim nodded and took a step forward. He couldn't afford any slackness. When they entered the hall, she was already sitting at a table by the window. She was young, beautiful as ever. Vadim always remembered how she had smiled at him when they first started dating, but now it all seemed fake. Her beauty couldn't hide the fact that she was part of this elaborate plan. When she saw Vadim, surprise flashed in her eyes, but she quickly pulled herself together, and a smile appeared on her face that Vadim remembered well. "And what brings you here, Vadim?" she said a little mockingly. "Did you really track me down?" "How did you guess?" Vadim said, stepping closer. "We know you're involved in a case, and I want to understand why you decided to go for it." She raised her eyebrows slightly, but for a moment there was a flicker of alarm in her eyes. Apparently, she hadn't expected it to be revealed so quickly. "What are you talking about?" she said, trying not to betray her nervousness. "I don't know what you mean." Maxim, who was standing a little farther away, intervened. "Don't play games with us, Kira. We know about your connection with Yevgeny Alexeyevich and your involvement in the plot against Vadim." Kira stood up from the table, pushing her coffee cup away. She was clearly upset, but her face remained calm. "You don't understand, Vadim," she said quietly but firmly. "My husband is more successful than you, and he needs your company." Vadim frowned. He couldn't believe her words. "Are you serious?" he said, increasingly losing patience. "And you say it so easily?" Kira was silent, but her gaze was cold and detached. She was clearly trying to maintain her confidence. "You know how much I care about my man's status," she continued, her eyes getting harder. "That's why I decided to help him." Vadim felt his anger flaring, but he couldn't let himself lose control. "I won't let you ruin everything," he said in almost a whisper. Kira stepped closer. "You've only become part of the big game. Your company will just become someone else's." "I'm sorry, it's nothing personal." Vadim stood staring at her. He couldn't even think that his ex-wife could be so cruel. "What a disgusting thing you are," he replied and headed for the exit. "Perhaps with this recording, it will be easier for us to prove their involvement." The lawyer smiled, showing the tape recorder. A month passed, and for Vadim, this period turned out to be a real test. All his strength, all his resources and time were spent on preparing for the trial. But finally, the day came when his future was decided. Anton and Evgeny Alexeyevich had both been caught in machinations, and now Vadim expected a decisive blow to those who tried to destroy his company. He sat in his office, his gaze focused on the computer monitor. He could not hide a sense of relief. The trials were over, and he could finally exhale. The reporters, the lawyers, the witnesses, all of that was behind him. Albert, his best friend and detective, walked into the office with a cup of coffee. "So, how are you feeling?" he asked, sitting down across from me. "To be honest, I feel like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders," Vadim admitted, leaning back in his chair. "We won. Anton and Evgeny Alexeyevich are in jail. Now I can concentrate on getting the company back." Albert grinned. "That's a victory, but don't forget, you have a lot of work to do to rebuild everything that was destroyed. Are you ready?" Vadim got up from the table and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Of course I am, he said with confidence. We've been through this, and I intend to put everything back the way it was, without compromise. An hour later, Vadim gathered all his employees in the meeting room. The atmosphere was tense, but joyful at the same time. Everyone had been waiting for this moment. He stood in front of them, and all eyes immediately turned to him. Friends, colleagues, he began, looking around at everyone. I am proud to stand before you. This month has been difficult for all of us, but we have overcome all the difficulties together. And today I want to introduce you to the man who played a key role in getting us back on track. Vadim turned around and gestured at the woman who was standing against the wall. It was Karina. Karina Belik, Vadim said, smiling. My new assistant and, without a doubt, a person who deserves our gratitude. The hall filled with applause. All the employees, not expecting such a turn of events, enthusiastically began to clap. Karina blushed with embarrassment, but her eyes filled with gratitude. Are you serious? She asked, still not believing what was happening. Vadim came up to her, took her hand and shook it. Yes, seriously, he replied. You deserve this position. Thank you for helping to bring the company back. And not only for that, you became the person I could rely on when all seemed lost. Karina stood there, not knowing what to say. It was hard for her to believe that she had gone from a lost employee to a key figure in the company. I don't know what to say, she said when the applause died down. I was just doing my job, but I'm honored to be part of this team. Karina still couldn't hide her emotions. She wanted to cry, but she held back because she realized that she deserved this success. All the years of working at the company seemed small and insignificant compared to what she had just experienced. When the working day was over, Vadim entered Karina's office. He knew that this was an important moment for her, and he wanted her to realize how much he appreciated her help. In his hands was a small gift bag. Karina, he said, walking into the office and smiling. This is a token of my gratitude. He held out the package to her. Karina looked at him in surprise, opening her mouth in astonishment. Is this something for me? She asked, smiling weakly. Vadim nodded and handed her the box. Open it, he said with a slight hint in his voice. Karina carefully unwrapped the package and saw the car keys. A shiny new SUV stood in the parking lot, and she couldn't believe her eyes. Oh, she exhaled, amazed. Is it true? Vadim smiled and nodded. Yes, it's yours. I hope you like him. Karina was shocked. This was more than just a gift. It was an acknowledgement of her hard work, her resilience and loyalty. It's incredible, she said, her voice trembling a little with emotion. Thank you, Vadim. I don't even know what to say. At this moment, emotions overwhelmed Karina, and she could not resist. She stepped to him and, without thinking, hugged him. It was a real and sincere feeling of gratitude. She couldn't hold back the tears that ran down her cheeks. This isn't a joke, she asked, pulling away a little, but continuing to look at him with unexpected timidity. Vadim smiled and touched her shoulder gently. It's not a joke, it's yours, he said. Karina couldn't believe her ears. This whole situation was so unexpected, and everything seemed unreal. Thank you, Vadim Borisovich, she said. Her voice was now full of gratitude and warmth. No, Karina, thank you. You deserve more. You deserve everything I can give you. You have no idea what this means to me, she whispered. Vadim turned and unexpectedly for both of them kissed her on the lips. Thus began their new story, but no longer about fighting for company, but about sincere feelings.